Hey there! This video is a detailed comparison between the Canon R5C and the Sony A7S III. And I'll spoil it up front, they are both incredible cameras and you really can't go wrong with either. But I know a lot of people are shooting on the A7S III or the FX3 and you're kind of curious about the R5C because it's a hot, new camera. And if you should switch to Canon or you should pick one up in addition to the A7S III because there's some other features. Overall, they're both awesome cameras. The R5C definitely has some more features, but it's more expensive and a little bit more complicated to use. In this video, I'll be doing a detailed comparison between these two, and I know that everyone uses their cameras differently. So what I recommend is you keeping score, taking notes, that sort of thing, because you'll have certain things that are more important to you and less important to you. So why am I comparing these two cameras? Well, the original R5 came out around the same time as the A7S III in 2020, so there's a lot of similarities there. Of course, the R5C definitely got some new features added to it over the original R5. Now, why did I not pick the FX3 to compare? Well, I think these are more similar because they both have EVFs. The FX3 does not have an EVF, and the FX3 also comes with that top handle with XLR inputs, and the R5C doesn't have that. So I think these are more comparable because of those things. So as I said, I'll do a detailed comparison, and then we'll go over image quality, dynamic range, autofocus, my recommendations, and all that sort of stuff. We'll start off by talking about what's the same between these two cameras. Of course, they're both full frame. They both shoot up to 4K 120. The R5C shoots in 8K, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but they will shoot up to 4K 120. In terms of audio inputs, they both have 3.5mm jacks, but you can get the XLR units for these cameras. The Sony one, you can get the XLR K3M, which is $600 and comes with a microphone. You can get the Tascam unit for the R5C, which is $500 and doesn't come with a microphone. They're both out of stock right now. I have no idea when they'll come back in stock, but those are options if you do need to get professional audio into these cameras. Now, one thing that I want to say, which I'll show you later in the examples, is that the image quality and dynamic range is very similar between these two cameras, and I think it's going to be a little surprising, so you'll see that in a little bit. Now let's kind of talk about what's different between these two cameras, and I have to say, I'm not going to say one is better than the other. As I said before, it's depending on what you need. All right, so the biggest thing is going to be the sensors between these two cameras. I know they're both full frame. The R5C shoots in 8K, and when you're using it in 4K, it's an oversampled image. Now, the A7S III is a slight oversampled image. It's like a 4.2K. I know a lot of people say it's a direct readout, but it's pretty close to a direct readout. So that will give you a more detailed image on the R5C and also helps with noise, and we'll talk about that a little bit later with low light and stuff. So there's a couple benefits of having that 8K sensor for video in that you can use Super 35 mode in 4K on the R5C, and that is a huge feature that I love on the R5C and also like on the A7 IV. So you can't do that on the A7S III because there's not enough megapixels there. The R5C will shoot in DCI. The A7S III only shoots in UHD. So if you need DCI, that is not an option on the A7S III. You'd have to upgrade to the FX6. Autofocus. I'll do an autofocus test later, but one feature that the R5C has is the face-only mode because it has the cinema operating system. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, in terms of RAW, the R5C will shoot 8K RAW internally, but it won't do 4K RAW, I think, as far as I'm concerned. The A7S III, if you want 4K RAW, you have to do it externally. So I don't personally shoot RAW, but if that's something that you need and you want to use that, those are the limitations between these two cameras. In-body image stabilization. The R5C does not have in-body image stabilization. It has an electronic stabilization. But I have to say that a lot of the Canon lenses, like the RF lenses, have stabilization in the lenses, which works really well. And the combination of the electronic IS and the lens stabilization is very, very good. I really do like that combo. I think it works really well. So to me, when they took IBIS out of this camera, it wasn't really a big deal to me. Now, the A7S III does have built-in in-body image stabilization, but a lot of their lenses, especially the ones that I use, don't have stabilization in the lens. I think they're pretty comparable. Again, it depends on the kind of stabilization that you need, but if you're just trying to hold a static shot, I think both are effective. It's just a different way of doing it. In terms of size, the A7S III is definitely smaller, which is a pro and a con. It's a little bit smaller to hold in your hand. The R5C is bigger, has a bigger grip. I think overall it feels better in your hand. In terms of build quality, they're both good. I think personally, I always like the feel of Canon cameras. This is my own personal thought. They just feel really good, the grip. But I have to say that the A7S III the grip that they put on this camera is way better than the older ones, and I think it's totally fine. So it's a personal preference thing, but again, not too much of a difference. I think they're both very durable cameras. Of course, the R5C has a fan in it, and it will not overheat. The A7S III does not have a fan in it, but you know what? I've never had it overheat before, so I don't know. I don't think it's really a big deal for that sort of stuff. In terms of the LCD screens, there's a big difference here. The LCD, they both have the flip-out screens, but I have to say that the R5C and all of the Canon screens are just better. The LCD screens on the Sony cameras are just terrible. It's smaller, the resolution's not as good, I feel like it's not as accurate. It's definitely something that Sony needs to improve on. So again, the LCD is great. I can't really comment on the EVFs. I don't really use EVFs. Now, lens options is a huge difference between these two cameras. Of course, the R5C uses the RF mount, and you can convert any EF lenses, but I think really you want to be shooting on RF lenses on this camera to really maximize the potential. Now, the RF mount is awesome, and I do love the lenses. It is not a complete package. I think there's a lot of stuff that needs to still get filled in, and it will. But for me personally, I use a couple of 2.8 zooms, and so that's like the 24-70 or the 15-35 are my go-tos. These lenses are awesome. They have built-in stabilization. They're also very large and very heavy and very expensive. Now, Sony, I think, definitely wins on the lens department because there are so many E-mount lenses, not just native lenses to Sony, but so many third-party options from people like Sigma and Tamron. And there's so many cool options out there right now for Sony, and they're still putting out new lenses for the E-mount system, like the 24-70 G Master Mark II. Just got this. Maybe a review coming out about this. This lens is super cool. So again, if you're going for lens options, there's just so many more options for the A7S III. I know the R5C can adapt EF lenses, but those are DSLR lenses. They're loud, they're a little bit slower to focus, all that kind of stuff. So again, depending on what you need, but overall, a lot of lens options for the A7S III. Now, battery life and rigging. This is a huge difference. The battery life on the R5C is terrible. I've talked about this plenty of times, and I just made a video recently about how to rig up this camera and try to keep it minimal, but this is where it gets complicated for the R5C. To use this for longer shoots and more professional work for video, you're gonna need external power. So you either need a battery grip, an external battery, those sorts of things. The A7S III battery lasts for a long time, and really you have a couple batteries in your pocket and you don't have to stress so much about it. Of course, you can rig it up if you have other accessories like follow focus and monitor and all that kind of stuff, but if you want to keep this small for gimbal work or vlogging or whatever, you don't have to stress about the battery. It's great. For photography, okay, this is a big one that people like to talk about. Now, the R5C has the beautiful photography of the R5, so it has that 45 megapixel sensor, and no one's gonna argue that the R5C is one of the best photography cameras on the market, and this has that built in. For me personally, I don't do much photography, so that's not a big win for me, but if you are looking for a true hybrid camera that can do both professional photography and videography, the R5C for sure. Now, that's not to be said, I don't want to leave out the A7S III because when this camera came out, and I've shot on this camera a lot, and the FX3, the photography in this camera is awesome. It's only 12 megapixels, but for most work that we're doing, so we're talking thumbnails if you're a YouTuber, if you're doing client work that's going online or on Instagram or for your own social media, it's great. The color science is awesome. When you compare this with the older cameras, I prefer the image out of the photography out of the A7S III to even like the A7R4, just because of the newer color science and all that stuff. So if you need to take some photography, don't think that this one's not capable. It's a very capable camera. Other things that I want to talk about here, HDMI port. I laugh because everyone knows that this is such a silly thing. The R5C has that little micro HDMI port. A7S III, full-size HDMI port, which all these cameras should have. So again, it's one of those things, I said, this is a little bit more complicated of a camera. I really wish it did have a full-size HDMI port. Media is a big difference. The R5C takes the CF Express type B, and also SD cards. The Sony takes CF Express Type A and SD cards. Now, I generally buy the Pro Grade 256 V90 cards because they work in like every camera for almost all the modes, so that's between the two of them. Those are running for right now at $290 for 256 gigs. If you want all the modes unlocked on the Sony camera, you need to get the CF Express Type A cards. The Sony card for 160 gigabytes is $400. The Pro Grade is a little bit less if you want to do that. Now, the other option about the R5C is there's a card from Angelbird right now that works great, and it's 512 gigabytes for $180, and that's a CF Express Type B card, which will open up all the different possibilities on this camera. Although I do really like the implementation of Sony because their memory cards are dual, so you can use both cards in both slots and get dual recording if you have the same card in both slots. The R5C has one of each, so a little bit more limiting in terms of memory cards, but again, it really depends on what you're trying to do. Now, the cinema operating system in the R5C is one of the coolest features about the R5C, and I hope we start seeing this hybrid of menu systems in Sony cameras. Like, it would be really cool if the FX3 had that. Maybe that's coming soon. I have no idea. So when you switch this over to video, you get the full cinema operating system, which is great. Because if you're doing video, it really is video focused at that point. You don't feel like you're using a stills camera. Now, for that, you get things like shutter angle, you get monitoring assist tools like waveform and false color. Man, those are so awesome. I absolutely love those. And now that I've been using them a lot on other cinema cameras, it's really cool to have that in a small camera like this. The other neat thing is that when you turn off the camera, the shutter closes to keep dust out. I love that. It's a new feature that you can see in like the A7 IV. Not sure why it didn't get in the A7S III. No idea. As I mentioned before, the fan and overheating, I don't think you're gonna have to worry about that between these two cameras. Now, a couple other things about the image here. You can control the noise reduction in the R5C. Now, the A7S III has built-in noise reduction, and if you want to be able to control the noise reduction in the Sony cameras, you need to get the FX6. The R5C definitely has control over that, and I made a whole video about that and what that does, so I'll leave that link down below. In addition to that, and when you talk about the image and dynamic range, the Sony has S-Log3, which is their highest dynamic range, flattest picture profile, and the R5C only has C-Log3. Now, the Canon's highest dynamic range, lowest, flattest, the best picture profile is C-Log2. Now, I know you can shoot this in RAW, and you can get the C-Log2 image sort of out of this camera and get a little bit more dynamic range, but I think for most people, are not shooting in RAW. And so those are, I think, the real use cases. And I'll talk about that a little bit later with image quality. All right, low light is something that is super important to a lot of people. And for me personally, it depends on where you shoot your, what ISO range you wind up in. And I did a whole video about the FX3 versus the R5C for low light. I'll leave that link down below too. Remember, the FX3 is the same as the A7S III inside, so that'll be the same for this camera. Now, they have dual base ISO, so the A7S III has a dual base ISO of 640 and 12,800. The R5C is 800 and 3200. So if you are shooting anywhere up to, let's say, 6,000, 8,000, somewhere in that range, the R5C is going to be a cleaner camera in terms of noise and all that kind of stuff, partly because the second high ISO range starts at 3200, and it's also an oversampled image, which helps compress the noise. So if you are going to be shooting sort of in that range up to, as I said, like that mid-range, the R5C is going to be a cleaner image. If you need super low light, like if you're a lot of wedding videographers and other situations where you're going to be shooting like where it's really dark, of course, the A7S III is going to win at 12,800 and up. But I think for most people, including myself, the R5C actually does better in low light or mid ISO. But high ISO, of course, the A7S III is going to be better. But go check out that video if you want to check that out. Now I want to get on to showing you some of the tests like image quality, dynamic range, and autofocus. But there's one point I want to make before we get into that. Let's talk about color science. Now, there is a lot of debate and opinions and subjectivity and discussion about Sony color science and Canon color science. I think a few years ago, there was a bigger difference, but Sony's come a long way, and their latest round of cameras, the color science is awesome. And because we're shooting in 10-bit on all these cameras, you have so much flexibility in post. And I think you'd be surprised they're a lot closer than you think. So you'll see in the examples for sure. Now for this test here, for lenses, I shot the Sony with the 24-70 G Master Mark II, and the Canon I shot with the RF 24-70L lens. The A7S III I shot in XAVC SI in 4K, and the Canon I shot in XF-AVC long op, because those are the ones that I use most often, and the bit rates are similar. So I didn't do this in RAW. Of course, you could if you have a RAW workflow. That might be something you'd be interested in. But for me, I think this is kind of where most people wind up. If not, it's pretty close. So those are the comparisons here. And what I want to do in the first group of images is look at image quality and dynamic range. I'll show you a series of images, and I'll show you the image and then identify them. So let's see how well you do. You might be a little bit surprised. So, how did you do? Honestly, how did you do? I think it was pretty tricky. And, you know, I'm not a professional colorist, but I did my best to try to match them as close as possible. And I was surprised how close I could get them, even with my skill set. So, image quality and dynamic range, I think, are very similar. And the dynamic range numbers have been verified by other people. I don't have a way to measure that, but they're very, very similar. But one thing that I noticed is that, of course, when you're shooting in S-Log3 versus C-Log3, the S-Log3 image is a lot flatter coming out of the camera. The C-Log3 image definitely has more contrast built in. So image quality and dynamic range, color science, they're so similar. I thought there was gonna be more of a difference because the R5C has that oversample, and I thought I would see more detail. But for me personally, they look pretty similar to me. So let's get on to talking about autofocus. So I did two examples here, one where I was moving around in and out of shadow, and one where it was a heavily backlit situation. I think the results from the autofocus test were not surprising and a little surprising at the same time. So I know a lot of people were concerned about the autofocus on the R5C because the R5 has awesome autofocus in video, but the R5C uses the cinema operating system, which autofocus is not as good. But I think the R5C hung in there against the A7S III. I would say the A7S III was definitely quicker and more accurate, but the R5C was definitely reliable in those tests. And from using this camera for a few months, you know, the autofocus works great. They both have eye detect autofocus. As I said before, one benefit of the R5C is that it has that face-only mode. Either way, autofocus is great. I give a slight advantage to the A7S III. Finally, let's go over pricing and then my overall thoughts and recommendations. The R5C is $4,500. The A7S III is $3,500. That's a $1,000 difference. That's a big deal. You can put that money towards lenses, media, all that kind of stuff. In terms of lenses, as I mentioned before, there are a lot more options for the A7S III. There's third-party options, a lot more inexpensive glass that you can buy. So that's a big difference. If you need a high megapixel stills camera, the R5C is definitely going to be your camera. If you really do a lot of photography and that's part of your professional work, the R5C. If you're just doing work for social media, thumbnails, you know, family stuff, like this is a great photography camera. So don't forget that. I think a lot of people just look at the numbers there. Now, one big difference, which I think is a huge deal for me, is the battery life between these two cameras. These are mirrorless cameras, and so they're meant to kind of be kept small. Of course, you can rig up any camera, but the battery life on the A7S III is great. The battery life on the R5C, as I've said so many times, is terrible. So you'll need a battery grip, external battery. You'll need to rig up this camera. If you are willing to rig up this camera and deal with things like the micro HDMI port and those sort of things, this can be an awesome camera for professional video work as well. This really does make this the first, in my opinion, true hybrid camera where it does photo at a very high level and video at a very high level. So again, it really depends on your needs. And they're both awesome cameras. But as I said, image quality is pretty close in video. So keep that in mind when you're trying to make your decision between these two cameras. If you have any questions, let me know down below. I have used the Sony system a lot in the last few years, and I've had this camera for just about 2 months. So I really appreciate you watching. And if you enjoyed this, please consider hitting subscribe. It really would be greatly appreciated. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.